Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our session this evening, which is part of our speaker series for our 150th anniversary. We're really glad that you're joining us tonight. There'll be an opportunity to entertain some of your questions. So if you want to place a question, please use the chat function and we'll be looking for them as we go along. We'll try to get to a few of them. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Franklin Foer to our community. Welcome, Franklin.
Thank you.
Frank, as we go along, as many of you know, Frank is a staff writer at The Atlantic, former editor of The New Republic, and the author of 5 books. His latest book, The Last Politician Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. He has really got the Jewish community buzzing with his recent Atlantic article, The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending. Great title, and certainly caught my attention, along with millions of other Jews. For details in this article, very well researched, I should say, rising anti-Semitism from both the left, the right, and reflects on the end of a unique period in Jewish history, one in which a now eroding liberal order afforded Jews unprecedented safety and prosperity. Likewise, Frank describes new threats to American Jews in academia, activism, and media as historic Jewish overrepresentation in these sectors declines. So glad, Frank, that you were willing to make time to speak with us at Anshe Emet about this widely read piece, the ideological underpinnings of ascendant anti-Semitism and the role of free speech and democracy in the future of America. American Jewry. Welcome, Frank.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
We're also privileged to have a person who's no stranger to the Anshe Emet family, Jonathan Eig. Jonathan is the best-selling author of 6 books, including his most recent, King, A Life, which the New York Times hailed as the definitive biography of Martin Luther King Jr. And this is a book that has received a variety of well-deserved awards. Jonathan's previous book, Ali, A Life, won the 2018 PEN America Literary Award. He has served as the consulting producer for the PBS series Muhammad Ali, which was directed by Ken Burns. He's written a number of other books. His 4th book, The Birth of the Pill, will be staged soon as a theatrical production by Timeline Theater in Chicago. Jonathan has also worked as a journalist, so he has a lot in common with Frank. And his greatest claim to fame, according to his parents at least, is that his name once appeared in a Jeopardy question, which was solved correctly for $200. So congratulations on that. This is a timely topic for us at Anshe Emet, since we just began construction on one of our entrances on Grace Street. It's an opening with glass doors and a great deal of glass on the walls. Our security advisors have urged us to build a wall to wall off the synagogue from the street in fear of an anti-Semitic attack. In this environment, it is just too exposed. Since October 7th, our security team has insisted on walking clergy home on Friday evenings from the synagogue. So this is the environment in which we are living. So with that, I'm going to turn the reins of this interview to my podcast partner of the pen and the yod, Jonathan Eig. And it's my fervent hope and prayer that Jonathan will give me the opportunity to interject just a few questions along the way.
Well, Rabbi, thank you for that introduction. You know, of course, that I would never even try. It would be futile to try to keep you from joining this conversation, but I really hope you'll enrich it with as many interruptions as you like. And Frank, it's great to see you again. Thanks for joining us on short notice. I know you've been incredibly busy since this article came out. Is this the most talked about article you've ever written?
I think so, because, well, it happens our people like to read, and our people like to read pieces that are about themselves. I think if I were to describe Jews after this experience, I'd say that they're people of the forward button, and that if you're going to write an article that has some viral potential, the Jewish community is probably a good target audience. So
It's good to know. I think journalists, editors all over the country should be paying attention to that. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to this story? You know, tell us the story of how it began and
Yeah,
share
sure.
a little bit about your journey.
So about a year and a half ago, I was talking to my brother who lives in Brookline, Massachusetts, and he's more observant than I am. He wears he's Shabbos observant and wears a kippah on Shabbat. And he told me, we were having a conversation. I said, look, I know anti-Semitism is a big deal, but I have to say it's never really touched my life. And he said, well, it's actually touched mine. When I'm walking down the street in Brookline, I had this experience with my family where a guy came up behind us and started muttering Trump, Trump, Trump in a very ominous sort of way. And we had to duck into a restaurant. My in-laws, Stiebel in Westchester County, was shot up with a BB gun, was desecrated. In Boston, there was something called the Mapping Project, which was a pro-Palestinian group anonymously drew this topography of Jewish Boston, nursery schools, NGOs, day schools, shuls, and described them all as being part of the Israeli war machine. And so for him, anti-Semitism felt like this very close to home phenomenon. And after that conversation, I thought to myself, well, I need to interrogate this much more seriously. And I feel like I haven't taken it quite as seriously as I should. And so I asked my editors if I could embark on a long piece about the resurgence of American anti-Semitism. And they said yes, but they also said that there was a challenge because it would be too easy to make it sound like an ADL report, and that would be bad magazine tradecraft. And so I started and I was reading and I was talking to people, but journalism being what journalism is, my attention kept getting drawn to whatever topic A was. And this project that I sincerely wanted to embark on was something where I was just collecting books on a shelf and it really wasn't going anywhere. And then October 7th happened and I saw the reaction to October 7th, especially that first week or so, where it felt like all of the terrible destruction, the pain that Jews had experienced and were feeling was not receiving the sort of universal sympathy that you would expect that it would have in the aftermath of an atrocity. And as I watched that first month after October 7th unfold, I thought, oh my gosh, well, now I really do have to seriously embark on this piece about anti-Semitism. It felt like I couldn't really write about anything else.
But you pivoted and went beyond just the question of modern day anti-Semitism to talk about the golden age of American Jews. And I'll show my cover here. There's no question mark there on the headline.
Yes.
It's over. You're declaring it over.
Yes.
So how did you pivot from writing about anti-Semitism to recognizing that we have lived through the golden age and it's over? My part two of that question is, were you aware that you were living through the golden age during your blissful youth?
Yes. Well, first of all, I started talking to a lot of college kids after this piece came out, and I have to tell them all the time, I'm really sorry that you didn't get to live through the golden age because it was really amazing. As they're describing to me all the difficulties that they experienced navigating campus life, navigating the complicated politics of Israel. But one of the benefits of having started to think about this subject much earlier on was that I had begun to think about some of the terms of the internal Jewish conversation that was happening about anti-Semitism, and I was thinking about what was emerging, that the kind of the illiberalism that was emerging on the right. I was much more focused on the illiberalism of the right at first, but I was trying to figure out how seriously should I take campus anti-Semitism? Was this really just a debate over Israel, or was this a debate about were there dangerous tropes about Jews creeping into that discourse as well? And I think wishfully, I wanted to believe that it was a debate about Israel and not a debate that had anti-Semitic overtones. I think eventually my conclusions about that shifted over time, where I felt like, okay, it's certainly about anti-Semitism as well as about Israel. But I was thinking about these debates about free speech, these debates about what the nature of progressivism is, what's the nature of the institutional temperament and spirit of higher education and these institutions that Jews revered. And I started thinking about the Jewish values that had infused so many of these norms that I think I had grown up cherishing, that I saw under attack, and saw how that was deeply interconnected to the rise of anti-Semitism, both on the right and left. And I was thinking there was something that had changed in American culture. And especially as I focused on what was happening in higher education, it was hard not to notice that the debates about Jewish life that were happening, the conversations about Jewish life that were happening, were connected to questions about admissions into those institutions as well. And that there was, among a lot of Jewish alumni, this sense of loss that they were seeing over the course of the last decade as admissions numbers for Jewish students began to drop. Now, I would question whether that's actually something that deserves to be mourned in a certain way, but I can understand why one would feel nostalgic for a period where Jews constituted something like 30% of Ivy League institutions. But as I was just pulling this all together in my head over the months, it felt to me like there was this peak in American Jewish life, and we had somehow fallen from that peak. And it was not necessarily a good or bad thing. In some ways, it was probably an inevitable thing, but it was also happening on a parallel track to this surge of anti-Semitism that I was seeing.
So you're not contending that anti-Semitism caused the end of the golden age. You're saying that they were simultaneous, or that is there a correlation in some way?
Yeah, there is a correlation that part of what made the golden age possible for Jews was that there was an ethos of liberalism that Jews, in a small L liberalism, that Jews helped to install in American culture as a consensus. And one of the benefits of that consensus was that it helped create an environment that was inimical to anti-Semitism, that type of liberalism was one of the things that helped stuff anti-Semitism into a box where it was locked up for a long period of time. And when liberalism started to come unglued in the 21st century, I don't think it's a coincidence that the chest where anti-Semitism was stuffed, was busted open and began to pour into the mainstream.
That's interesting. I see what you're talking about. In particular, I see it, having just written this King book, in the Black-Jewish relationship and the civil rights movement, when this liberalism worked both ways, right? The Jewish community is helping to show that it supports civil rights, and the Black community is happy to have the support of the Jewish community, because there is this golden age of Judaism, right? Where we've seen the potential for America to forget some of its hatred, and maybe we can do it again with the Black community, right? So there's this consensus forming that seems to be spreading. And is that one of the high watermarks of the golden age?
Yeah, most certainly. That I think Jews had been attracted to the civil rights movement before there was really such a thing as a civil rights movement. A number of the founders and early chairs of the NAACP were Jews. And I think that grew out of a sense that in order to protect the place of American Jews in American society, you needed to install very broad protections for ethnic minority groups. And that was an ethos that began in the Progressive era. So, way before World War II. And then after World War II, when Jews actually begin reaching the mainstream, they take this ethos and really much more aggressively begin to apply it to the broader world. It's not just about fighting religious discrimination laws that were keeping Jews out of neighborhoods or universities. It became about installing this much broader set of civil rights protections for African Americans in particular, And it was almost as if I think Jews joined the civil rights movement in part with a real sense of missionary zeal, that this phenomenon that had just benefited them, they were then going to pass on down the line. And there was a lot of paternalism that was baked into that. And there was a lot of misguided assumptions about the ways in which African Americans were kind of just like Jews. And if only they had the same opportunities that Jews had, then, they would succeed just like Jews, that the Jews took their own story and used it as a template for other ethnic groups. And I think there were blind spots in that type of diagnosis of American life. But yes, that was the high water mark.
In the civil rights marches, there were so many Jews wearing kippot that people of color began wearing them and calling them freedom caps.
Right.
So this was really something remarkable. On Monday, I was on a call with a very thoughtful Black religious leader who has led seminaries around the country and has been and continues to be a true friend to the Jewish people. And he had a meeting with a small group of rabbis, and he wanted to send a powerful warning to them. And here I'm going to quote what he said. The most powerful force in the 20th century for human rights has been the Black Jewish Coalition for Human Rights in the United States. What is happening in Gaza may shatter that. So, Frank, I'm wondering if you would respond, and John, if you wanted to think about that as well. I'm interested in your response to that.
Well, there is an antecedent for this, which was after the 6-Day War, when Israel suddenly became conquered the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and suddenly there were all these large number of Palestinians and Palestinian refugees who were governed by Israel. That coincided with the rise of third worldism in the New Left, and you had a large part of the civil rights movement, the younger participants in the civil rights movement, begin to take a very negative attitude towards Israel, which was something that deeply unnerved many liberal American Jews who had been locked in that coalition for them before. It was a very traumatic moment for much of American Jewry, and there was a lot of repercussions for American Jewry that flowed from that moment of tension and discomfort. And I would say almost certainly the same thing is happening now. That in the aftermath of George Floyd, the rise of Black Lives Matter, Palestinian groups and the Black Lives Matter movement made common cause, and there were a large number of activists who went over to the West Bank to see what life was like for Palestinians in the West Bank, and they came away with a narrative that there was these deep interconnections. There's some specious parts of this narrative, it needs to be said, including the fact that you hear a lot about how Israelis have trained American police officers, and so that American police are simply replicating what Israelis do to Palestinians, which is not true. That those training programs don't really exist in the way that they have been, remotely exist in the way that they've been portrayed in some of this discourse. But I think this is a very perilous moment. And one of the perils of it is that in response, I think the Jewish community will decide that rather than doing the hard work of coalition building and existing, the hard work of living within a pluralistic society, the impulse will be to retreat. That there are lots of progressive groups that say things that should be described as anti-Semitic. And so to participate in coalitions with people who you know to be anti-Semitic is a revolting thing on a personal level. But I think to continue to exist within liberal progressive coalitions, which I think a large number of American Jews would like to do in order to live out their Jewish values, it will require finding a way to navigate those relationships. And to me, I know this is something that you've been involved with in the coalition. There's the hard work of living with political difference and of persuasion. And I think that if as a community, if we abandon persuasion as a technique, if we abandon persuasion as part of our democratic practice, we're resigning ourselves to a very, very dangerous situation where, while hunkered down and in a self-protective crouch, we let the rest of the world make assumptions about us. We by entering into dialogue, we get stuck in a vicious cycle of enmity with people. And I think we're in for a hard road in trying to find a way to maintain and repair these relationships.
The only corrective that I would offer, Frank, is, as a rabbi who has been working for decades now to build the Black-Jewish dialogue, you talked about the Jewish community retreating. I would say that during this period since October 7th, I, as a rabbi, feel radioactive.
Yes.
In other words, I'm not sure. I mean, I have certain pastors that I speak to, and I speak to them often. We work together on some very powerful projects, but it is a very, very difficult task to not get a call back, to not hear from people who I've worked with in the interfaith community for a long time. And that's a tough issue that I'm not sure how we're going to come back from.
And hard not to receive as anti-Semitism, because whatever your position on Israel, the fact that you have a friendship with them and suddenly, maybe without even knowing what your position is on the war, that you become a persona non grata, somebody who is ostracized in that sort of way, it's hard not to see anti-Semitism in that.
So, John, you wrote the definitive book on Dr. King. What are you thinking about as you listen to this conversation?
Well, I think that it's all true what you're saying, and I think that what as Frank framed it in the very beginning, there was this alliance because we had in common the issue of discrimination, the issue of being in the minority and being threatened, and now it's difficult because there's this reluctance, I think, to view Jews as minorities or to view them as victims, and in part, as your article really explores, Frank, that we are in a more powerful role now in many cases, right? So how do you remind people that there's this common bond when the inclination is to treat the Jews as oppressors, especially after October 7th?
Yeah, no, the nature of political coalition building has changed as the ideology of the left itself has changed over time. I mean, I think it's almost a cliche now to talk about the way in which this analysis that divides the world into oppressors and oppressed has become so problematic for Jews, because it essentially excludes us from the possibilities of joining a coalition, that we've been written out of the category of the oppressed. And on some level, it's hard to disagree with that. And even in the case of Israel, it's possible to say that in certain instances we actually are oppressors. But what anti-Semitism is something that breaks these taxonomies. Anti-Semitism is an accusation that Jews have too much power. It's an accusation that Jews are oppressors, that we have nefariously obtained an outsized role in society, which we wield for self-gain out of dual loyalties. And what's so frustrating is that the rest of the world, the left, is incapable of seeing anti-Semitism when it exists, or even when it comes out of their own mouths, because it's so outside of the way in which they've drawn these constructs for interpreting the world.
So I'm sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
I was going to ask you, Rabbi, as well. Why do you think that's the case? Where have we failed? We control the media. Why have we failed to deliver the message in this way that we need to continue? This piece helps, obviously, but in what way have we failed to because that's an issue of messaging, I think, to some extent.
I think it is, but in a way, the golden age that Frank was talking about feeds into this larger a narrative that Jews control everything, from Dr. Ruth to every television show. It goes from place to place. So Jews are everywhere. We've succeeded in every place. 30%, the Ivy League schools are filled with Jews. So when Jews begin to speak out and say, this is a dangerous situation for us, people are looking at you and saying, what are you talking about? How could you even talk about being in danger, right? You control everything. So in a sense, aren't we a victim of our own success?
Yeah. No, there's no doubt that that's true. There's also no doubt that our outside success in all of these various areas stokes a measure of resentment or jealousy that I think infuses a lot of the blindness that you've just described. One of the I'd say gratifying, but that's the wrong sort of word. But one of the things that I've heard from a lot of people in the aftermath of my piece is that they'd experienced a feeling of being gaslit by the world, that these things would happen to their kids, or they would see these things in their neighborhood. Somebody would shout something to them on the street, and they would say, this is anti-Semitic. I know this is anti-Semitic. And then when they would talk about it to the wider world, they would be told, no, it's not anti-Semitic. It's just about Israel. No, you're being too sensitive to this thing. And so, especially I think in schools, that's been the case, that school administrators have been blithely dismissive of anti-Semitism in their school systems or on their campuses. And so to be seen, to feel like these feelings of being under assault are seen by a major publication, I think there's some salutary effect that has.
We do have a question from one of our audience participants, William Nelson. He asked, Daniel Dresdner attributes your results to the attitudes of elites and not the mainstream. What's your response?
That is somewhat true. I mean, I think one of the things I wanted to do with this piece was to help us break free from a lot of our partisan blinders. That when we talk about anti-Semitism, usually we can't help but fall back on all of these habits that we've inherited in this age of intense polarization. I'm on one team. My team is the side of the angels. The other team, they're the devils. There can never be anything really wrong with my team. If there's a problem, it exists entirely on the other political team. And what I wanted to do was to say, look, to understand where we're at and why it's so dangerous, we all need to step back, and we need to examine the totality of the political system spectrum to examine the ways in which this is both a right and a left problem. And those problems feed off of one another in a way, but they're in also ways a little bit distinct. That right-wing anti-Semitism, the possibility that somebody could walk into a synagogue and massacre Jews, I think is largely a right-wing threat. The experience that we have on college campuses is something that is or in certain coastal school districts is maybe not a widespread phenomenon. It's hard to say, but when people have polled the experience of Jewish kids on college campuses, there's very different experiences that kids have based on the campuses that they're on. Even in elite campuses, there are different experiences, and some of that depends on the leadership of those campuses. In places like Dartmouth or Wesleyan, where you have university presidents who are committed to taking the problem seriously and finding a way to navigate through it, you have somewhat lower incidence of reports of anti-Semitism. In places like Washington, there are lots of schools that are experiencing very little anti-Semitism that also happen to be elite schools. So it varies, but I don't think that I would dismiss it as an elite phenomenon at all. And even if it was an elite phenomenon, I would be extremely worried about it, given the nature of elites.
Since the article appeared, what's surprised you most in terms of the reaction?
Well, this is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but I expected there to be. I wrote the piece, and when I handed it in, my copy editor, who happens to go to my shul in Washington, said, "Where are you going to be on the day that the piece publishes? You're going to get creamed." And one of the editors who worked on my piece, now I'm saying all sorts of things that refute the idea that the golden age of American Judaism is over, because I don't just work with Jews. But I had another editor who is Orthodox who'd read the piece, and he's like, "You're going to get massacred for this." And so hearing things like that from outside readers as I was preparing for publication, I anticipated that I was going to just get beat up, especially by people on the left. And when the piece was published, I actually didn't receive that much of a backlash from the non-Jewish left. I received a lot of criticism from the Jewish left, who seemed to argue that any criticism of the left was not fair, that the problem is just a right-wing problem. So I was actually surprised by how my piece was welcomed into the world.
Huh. Was there any criticism from the left that you felt resonated the most, that you kind of related to?
I think that I've heard from some people on the left that my depiction of the golden age was a little bit too gauzy, and that there were lots of Jews who didn't experience the golden age as so golden, and there were lots of problems with the Jewish idea of liberalism that I didn't acknowledge in the piece. And I think that that's all very, very true.
Another question from the audience. Jen Tesher asked this question, which is John's wife.
So it's a very good question.
What can we do now as Jews to simultaneously call out anti-Semitism and also protect ourselves?
I think we have to be unapologetic in calling out anti-Semitism wherever it emerges from. One of the reasons that we're in this place, I think, is that we've let a lot of stuff slide over time. I remember listening to the podcaster Joe Rogan talk about Jews and money in a totally anti-Semitic sort of way, and there was barely a peep about it. Lots of Jews from the center right who go on his show, they didn't really register any sort of massive complaint about this when it was happening. I think a lot of Jews on the left kind of let some of Ilhan Omar's remarks about Jewish influence on politics slide for a long time. We just assumed they were naive, and so I think calling stuff out is actually a really important. It's the most important thing. And what can we do to protect ourselves? This is the harder question, and I wish the Jewish community didn't have 100 different generals. I wish there was something like a Jewish Pope or a Jewish Vatican that could come up with a document that was a strategy for navigating post-liberal America. That would, in that document, you would outline a comprehensive strategy for combating anti-Semitism. There would be a comprehensive strategy for helping to re-legitimize the state of Israel and Israeli culture, and in a way that appealed to a broader sector of America that would be, you know, a 25-year plan for doing these sorts of things. But one of the things, you know, my piece is doom and gloom, but one of the things that was true in the golden age of American Jewry, and that remains true now, is that we have incredible resources as a community. And I'm not just talking about financial resources. I'm talking about intellectual capital. I'm talking about creativity. I'm talking about deep commitment to the sense of Jewish peoplehood that exists, I think, you know, in the whole broad spectrum of American Jewry. And all those things should mean that we have within ourselves the capacity to innovate and think our way out of the predicament that we're in, which doesn't mean that we will return to a golden age. You can't stuff the anti-Semitic genie back into the bottle. Once it's out, it's out. But what we can do is we can do what we did during the golden age, which is we can articulate a vision of America that is broadly appealing, that is both good for the Jews and good for America, and can help restore America's democratic stole.
Yeah, I like that response. You talked about Israel there, so I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you know, the age of the golden age of American Jews is ending. What's the state of Zionism? Is the golden age of Zionism ending too?
Yes, I'm afraid so. I mean, I think that one of the miraculous things about the peak of the golden age of American Jewry was that you did have this incredible bipartisan consensus about Israel. Now that's obviously shattered. Israel right now has allowed itself to rush into the deepest public relations nightmare that a country could have, where it's managing right now to tick off a lot of people who had regarded themselves as friends of Israel. It produces all sorts of, there's all sorts of unfortunate side effects of a morally justified war that have now resulted in imagery that enemies have exploited to the max. I think that a lot of the Palestinian Students for Justice in Palestine, a lot of the pro-Palestinian groups have been far shrewder than the Israelis or the American Jewish community in framing this issue over time and thinking about who are the persuadable audiences in America who you can integrate into your coalition. How can you manipulate American public opinion to best benefit your cause? They've succeeded. I think their campaign was based on the aim of delegitimizing Israel, and you have to say that it's like they're pretty close to job done on that, at least with very, very important segments of the American populace. I mean, the polling among Democrats right now about Israel is shocking. It's just it really is shocking.
Rabbi, did you want to comment on that too? I'd be curious to see if you agree.
Well, I don't think you can really argue the point that Israel's public relations has really taken a terrible hit along the way. I would also say that this was, in a way that Israel has, fallen right into the trap that was set for it. But having just come back from Israel last week, we live in two different universes as Jews. Because without a strong response to Hamas, Israel doesn't, and this leave Netanyahu out of this. The vast number of Israelis don't feel that the Zionist project, Israel, is viable, right? If they can't respond. Now, um, how they respond and what war looks like. It's all the rest. And the regular showing of videos on a daily basis from Gaza has had a very, very serious effect. But as Michael Oren says again and again, no country has ever fought a war like this. Now, where the enemy's below ground and the civilians are above ground, et cetera. And said they found a tunnel yesterday that went right into Israel. They never knew this tunnel existed. So the threat is very real. So the appetite in Israel to continue this war is very strong. And it's a very different universe than the one that we inhabit here in America. I mean, it's sort of whiplash coming home. And the only thing that people want to talk about is the humanitarian crisis. But in Israel, the only thing people want to talk about is the hostages. So that's a challenge. And it's also dividing world Jewry in a very real way.
Yeah. Well, you could argue that a lot of those differences in values between American Jews and Israeli Jews, they were always there, because American Jews had constructed certain ideas about themselves that were suited towards a different neighborhood and a different society, and their challenges are very different than the challenges that American Jews have faced. And I don't want to make I always try to resist making this conversation about anti-Semitism a conversation about Israel, because I think that it's important for us to be able to separate these two things on some level. We know as American Jews that whatever happens in Israel does play some role in the way in which we're perceived here, and that, if there hadn't been this last 6 months of war, would we be experiencing the same surge of anti-Semitism? No. But in fact, we were experiencing a pretty serious surge of anti-Semitism before October 7th as well. And so I think it's hard conceptually to untangle these two things, because they do braid, but they also have tracks that exist and parallel over time. And I just go back to the fact that if we saw Chinese Americans being blamed for what was happening to the Uyghurs or what was happening, and we would have no qualms about calling that out as bigotry. But when this happens with American Jews, these kids on campus, they're not citizens of the state of Israel. Their opinions about what the Israeli government is doing are completely irrelevant to the outcome that happens there. Yet their classmates are saddling them with everything and acting as if they bear some personal moral responsibility for what's happening, and that's anti-Semitism.
Frank, you end your book by saying that although it's hardly an ironclad law of history, such societies are prone to decline when Jews are thrown out of the country. England entered a long dark age. Tsarist Russia limped toward the revolution after the pogroms. If America persists on its current course, it will be the end of the golden age, not just for Jews, but for the country that nurtured them. And when I read this line, it really resonated with me. At the same time, I said, well, gosh, I'm not sure how you would get that point across. Like, how would you even begin that process? But by the same token, kind of tying this back to our conversation about Zionism, Israelis will tell you this isn't a war against Israel. This is a war against the West. And what happens to Israel is coming to America. What happens to Israel is coming to France and England. And I wonder how you get that message across, because I think it's a real one.
Yes. So I would not put it the way that the Israelis are putting it, because I don't know. It's, that would have tracked, I think, after September 11th. but it feels like at least the American public has kind of turned the page on that chapter in its history. And so
It will be labeled Islamophobia.
it's not just being labeled Islamophobia. I mean, this is actually one of the things that people struggle with Joe Biden. Joe Biden is a Zionist. He loves Israel. But even if he didn't love Israel in the way that he did, an American president would be supporting Israel pretty fervently because they're involved in a proxy war with Iran, which is a country that has interest and an ideology that is extremely opposed to the United States, that is bent on, that we've been sanctioning for reasons that have nothing to do with Israel, that has been funding, helping the Russians in their war in Ukraine, who have their own terrorist networks, who've been trying to exert domination of a region in opposition to our other longstanding allies in the region, not just Israel, but the Gulf states as well. It's in America's interest to support Israel. That's the realist case. That's the core reason why the Biden administration is doing what they're doing in Israel. But you can't make that's not a very persuasive case, I don't think, to people on the left, for sure. But I think what I focused at the very end of my piece that you call out, I wrote that because I wanted to try to reach across and kind of shake the world, and not just the Jewish world, to shake the Gentile world and say, look, this is the treatment of American Jews, the resurgence of anti-Semitism. These are the warning lights flashing. The dashboard is flashing. These are the alarm bells that are sounding that there's a crisis within American democracy. This is symptomatic of the way in which we've allowed conspiratorial thinking to flourish in our society. It's the way in which we are incapable of having these conversations across ideological lines. It's about the decline of trust and authority in our society. It's the way in which our democratic habits have fallen into disuse. And the reason to care about anti-Semitism is not because you care about your Jewish neighbor, it's because you care about America.
Yeah, so on that note, we have a question from Regine Meisel. If the golden age of American Jews is ending, what replaces it? What is the future of American Jewry, and what can we do to help it so that future isn't as grim as it may seem at times?
Yeah. All right. So the golden age of American Jewry exists on an apex up here, and there are different slopes that in different plateaus we could land on as we move forward. The next stop on the train is not Auschwitz. We're not. I don't, and I know that that's the way the Jewish mind works. Is that we read the Haggadah, we read the Megillah, we read all of these canonical stories that have the same narrative arc, where things are great and then they become disastrous. Pogroms descend. And I anticipate what's going to happen is that we're going to return to some sort of baseline norm of global history that's in between, somewhere in between catastrophe and the golden age, where Jews will still be prosperous, but not, but maybe not have the same influence that they had in the culture, where anti-Semitism, which we thought was dead and gone, becomes something that's more socially acceptable. It becomes something, it'll no longer be shocking to hear these stories about what gets said in schools or bullying that happens. But none of that is, it's not good, but it's not catastrophic either. And it's also not entirely bad for American Jewry to, on some level, I was meeting the other week. I got to meet with the heads of the Reform, Conservative, Orthodox movements, the heads of Hillel, Jewish summer camps, JCCs, etc. And one of the things that they were experiencing was that there had been this surge of Jewish identity that had happened in the aftermath of October 7th. I mean, anti-Semitism happens to be, for better or for worse, something that helps to ballast a sense of Jewish peoplehood, Jewish community. Optimistically, I would say I'd seen all of these October 8th Jews that I'd met, especially moms and dads who have kids on college campuses or kids in public schools who were experiencing some forms of anti-Semitism, and they had minimal connections to organized Jewish community, but out of fierce desire to protect their kids, they became activists, and they were organizing groups that would go to school board meetings or to city council meetings, and they became really proudly self-identifying Jews, completely disconnected from the organized Jewish community. But there's something to grasp onto there. With Jewish summer camps, I've heard that jobs that had once been filled by counselors who were imported from abroad, now being filled with Jewish college students who, or you see this as an opportunity to do something that connects them to their people. Hillels have experienced an uptick in attendance since October 7th. So these are all signs of things that are actually, in the end, healthy unintended consequences of a horrible moment.
So I'm
I
hearing
hope that I hope it gets leveraged into something that is actually lasting. I mean, Rabbi, there's something like 9 students right now at JTS in this graduating class at Jewish Theological Seminary who are going to become rabbis. And, it's like, is there a way to leverage this moment so that you can get the best and the brightest to go into the rabbinate, to go into communal leadership where their brains are needed? Or maybe there's something different that's happening. I hear stories at Brown of kids who are on the left who have broken away from Hillel and have created their own lay prayer communities. Yes. And I hear about how powerful those communities are. It makes me think back to the rise of the Havarah movements, that came out of that moment that I was describing before, where Jews felt really disappointed about the reaction of the left to the 67 war. They're fruitful paths.
A week or so ago, I had a conversation with Barry Feinstone of the Jim Joseph Foundation. And he made a very similar point to the one that you made. We were actually talking about the pipeline and rabbinical schools and all of that. And he made the point, and the Jim Joseph Foundation is very much focused on that, each cohort, that we're witnessing a resurgence of young people who are turning to the Jewish community, just as you noted with camps. And the test of the Jewish community is how it's going to pivot. How creative will we be to harness this, not only brain trust, but this group who's now looking for something meaningful as Jews? And we dare not miss this opportunity because, as he said, that window is going to close and people will kind of return back to whatever they were doing before. So there is an opportunity. Every synagogue, including Anshe Emet, has seen an uptick. Even in our Jews by Choice program, which is a large program to begin with, we have a number of people who have come to the Jews by Choice program because of October 7th. They said, I need to be part of this people. And that was a remarkable thing. That was inspiring to all of us. So we're seeing this. And as I said a minute ago, will we be creative enough, entrepreneurial enough to embrace the opportunity?
Yeah.
As our former mayor, Rahm Emanuel, used to say, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good way for us to wrap it up and maybe have a concluding note here, because I'm hearing a little bit of a conflicting message. You know, Frank is saying that this may be the canary in the coal mine, and that we may be, you know, seeing the decline of the democracy and the shattering of unity. And the other hand, a moment of opportunity that we may be able to reassess and reevaluate and find inspiration. So I guess I would just ask you each to, you know, briefly give some parting words of hope that, you know, where, as Dr. King asked, where do we go from here?
I'm going to leave that to Frank. I actually have one more question, so I'm going to try it that way, if that's okay with you, Jonathan.
For it.
Right. So one message of hope. I mean, one thing I've been thinking about is how can we as Jews take on the question of democracy? And I know that there've been a lot of efforts and fits and starts from people to try to connect the two, and maybe congregations, because there's some political overtones to it, haven't the question. I mean, I don't think there's anything necessarily partisan about the question of preserving democracy, but everything is partisan in America today. Thinking about how, if really the way to insulate ourselves, to protect ourselves going forward, is to really not just turn inward and try to capitalize on this surge of interest and participation, sense of peoplehood that have emerged, but also to really you know, what is the successor story to the civil rights movement? You know, you have all of these poll workers in places who've decided not to participate because it's too scary to do so. You know, why isn't the Jewish community helping to supply poll workers right now? I look at the questions about cancel culture and the like, and the question of how to model disagreement. And I think it's Jews need to be fearless on this topic, even if it's occasionally painful for us to do so. That we need to say that, you know, there's certain times when the pro-Palestinian people in our community want to cancel events where Palestinian, or, you know, people who are sympathetic to Palestinians are speaking, and I would want to reject that, because that's illiberalism. I mean, you know, we have to be clear about some of these distinctions. Like on college campuses, if you're bringing a terrorist into a college campus to talk to students, that's bad. That should not happen in a college campus. And we need to be clear about the way in which how free speech works and how to preserve. But there are basic ways in which we can tend to democratic norms in our own behavior, and even within our own communities, in the way in which we model how Jews of different political persuasions and different opinions about the things we care most deeply about can coexist and can have healthy, respectful dialogue with one another.
You know, I'm not going to ask the question because that's such a positive place to come to in this conversation. Instead, I'm going to build on what you're saying, if that's okay, Frank.
Please.
In the back of Anshe Emet, in our sanctuary, is the only synagogue in the United States that I know of that has Abraham Lincoln and George Washington in stained glass, huge windows, and the New York Harbor. And when I came to the synagogue, I thought it was a paean to the immigrant experience. Count us, we're Americans, one of those kinds of patriotic moments. But I learned the true story of those windows was that in 1940, there was a different window and there was a creation scene. And those windows were shattered by American Nazis in 1940. And the rabbi decided, Solomon Goldman, who was a great Zionist leader and a great believer in America, he decided to put those windows, as American windows, up in the back of the sanctuary. Because and those windows, by the way, face the street. And so what he was doing was he was demanding that America be America. And I think that I've looked at those windows every Shabbat for a long time now. But it's more than 80 years since those windows were put in. We're dealing with our own shattered windows. There's broken glass. We are seeing things that we never thought that we would ever see in our lifetime. Now, when I grew up, I remember the debates about whether America is different, right? Jews have suffered and been exiled out of every country. They've been persecuted in every country they've lived in. So what gives you the right to think that America is different? But I do, and I've always believed that America is different. But unless we engage ourselves, just as you were saying, in the American experience, in the voting experience, in the Democrat, in a participatory democracy, then we will have failed in the responsibility. You can't just use words to demand that America be America. We have to be part of the process of change to get there. And I think your article really served as a very powerful wake-up call. I don't know anybody who was shocked by it. I think a lot of us suspected it, but your research was so meticulous that it was very hard to look away, right? Your discussion of what was going on in San Francisco was, positively chilling. So here we are. And I'm going to give you, Jonathan, the last word.
Can I say one thing? And I don't want to extend this too much. I just want to say, in the aftermath of my article, I've had occasion to talk to many rabbis, and I've come to the conclusion, after college presidents, after Speaker of the House, rabbis have the hardest job in America. They're trying to hold communities who are traumatized, who are enraged, who are sad in their hands. And my plea is hug your rabbi. That's all I'll say. So thank you.
I will hug my rabbi next time I see him, Frank. And what I want to say is, in conclusion, is thank you for this article. It shines a light on a problem, and now that we have that light, it's up to us to follow and move forward in its path. And I thank you for giving us that opportunity.
Yeah,
we shall overcome, right, Jonathan?
Amen, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody.